It's hearing stories like this, which is why we're really here at this conference. It's clear that illness definitely has a ripple effect, impacting not only the patient, but also their loved ones. Whether you're a researcher, physician, politician, or a leader of faith, you're all here for the same reason, to help patients and their families. PatientCentricity echoes this mission and emphasizes a collaborative relationship between patients and healthcare providers. Patients are empowered to make their healthcare decisions alongside their physician, not just be the passive recipient of care. And certainly the people that you've just seen are not passive. So here to expand on this revolutionary idea is Kimberly McCleary, Senior Advisor of FasterCures at the Milken Institute. Kim?
Good afternoon. So I think a lot of what we've already heard today, as Meredith just said, reminds us why we're all here in this room together. And we're all here on behalf of the patient. And it's kind of expected at this point in our culture and in our time that we would invite the patient to be part of this conversation and be part of the dialogue we're having. But it hasn't always been that way. And so what I hope to do in the next few minutes is just sort of retrace a little bit of the history of how we got to this place where we now all kind of collectively expect that we're going to interact with patients, we're going to hear from them and understand their viewpoints as part of the kind of conversation that we're having over this next 3 days. So if we look back over time, maybe as long as Rome has stood, there have really only been 2 traditional roles for the patient. They could be a subject in medical research, or they could be a patron of medical research, and they were really otherwise considered sort of the object of the research, but not really an important part of it except for the body samples and the money they could bring to the enterprise. And really, we thought of the patient as sort of, as Meredith, you just said, the passive recipient of the collective knowledge of the experts, and their viewpoints weren't really taken into consideration. If we fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, and this is an entirely US perspective, and I realize I'm sitting here in Rome, so forgive me my ugly Americanism on this one. But if we think back to the middle of the last century in the US, following World War II, when the rise of government, the confidence in big companies to solve our problems was really sort of at its peak, we get to the 1960s and we have things like the thalidomide scandal. We have the involvement in Vietnam that really started to undermine public confidence in both the government and large institutions in general. Kind of leading into the 70s, where we had civil rights actions and we had disability rights and we had women's rights. How many people were alive and remember 1973? I'm looking around, I think most of us. We had the battle of the sexes on the tennis court with Bobby Riggs thinking he could, prove once and for all that men were better than women, and that luckily turned out to not to be the case in that particular tennis match. We also had the beginnings of Watergate forming in that year. A lesser-known event that took place in 1973 was the American Hospital Association issued what it described as the Patient's Bill of Rights. It might surprise you to know that this Bill of Rights was the first time that a patient could reasonably expect to be told their diagnosis. So up until that point, it was really the doctor's business, what he or she, mostly he, was writing down in the file and deciding about the medical treatment. It also gave patients a somewhat less used expectation that they could participate in decision-making about the care that they would receive. So this was pretty revolutionary, but it did give rise to the start of more organizations of patients kind of finding one another and banding together to fund medical research in a more concerted way than just the individual benefactor, and to bring patient views to the knowledge of lawmakers and scientists and to start to be more involved in these things. When we get to the 1980s and the HIV/AIDS crisis, there was a step change again in what the expectations around patient involvement and advocacy looked like. And the AIDS activists were sort of the first to come into contact with the industry, the biopharmaceutical companies, to make them understand what they were looking for and the urgency of new treatments for HIV/AIDS, and also the regulators who were, in their eyes, sort of keeping the public or AIDS patients from accessing promising therapies that were coming through the pipeline. And the FDA also at that point decided that it would be beneficial for perhaps a single patient to start sitting on some of the decisions that would come very late in this long path of getting a new medical product to market. All right, well, fast forward to the beginning of this decade, when a lot of this work had started to really pay off, that there was more respect for the views of patients. There was some policy that helped to move this along. And now we have kind of a system and a setting where the FDA, the regulatory agency in the United States, is telling industry, by way of things like this slide, that they should be involving patients not just kind of episodically and from time to time when they run into trouble, but continuously and comprehensively and consistently all across the process of developing a new medicine and bringing it to market. The FDA and patient groups and now industry is coming along with the recognition that patients, like the ones you've heard from today, really are the experts in the kinds of decisions that they have to make about their diagnosis, about the care they seek, about the outcomes that are important to them, about the elements of their condition and the things that matter most in their daily lives. We heard from the panel before lunch of the religious leaders talking about really aligning care with the patient's goals. And I think that's the real crux of what patient centricity is about. It's not just going after a cool target in a petri dish. It's about understanding how is this going to impact a patient's life and help them to fulfill the kinds of activities that are most important to them. We've started to see some products coming through the pipeline as a result of this new age of patient centricity, and I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. The first on the left is a bariatric device used to help patients control obesity. And the company that was bringing this to market had focused in on 2 particular endpoints for its clinical trials. The FDA, at the same time, knowing this was going to be perhaps the first device in obesity in about 40 years' time, did some additional research on their own to understand what are the trade-offs that people living with obesity look at in terms of how much weight do they feel they need to lose, how much time do they need to be able to have that weight control in order to accept some of the potentially risky side effects of this surgery. And what they found was, even though the device maker didn't select the right outcomes, the device actually paid off in ways that were important to the patients, and they went ahead and put that product on the market. We have the first gene therapy approved in the US at the end of 2017 that was really fostered through kind of a co-development process by the Foundation Fighting Blindness and the manufacturer that focused on some new outcome measurements that were really important to patients, both in bringing this kind of new technology to market and also in delivering pretty much a cure for a very rare form of blindness. And then Exondys 51 on the right side, a treatment for Duchenne muscular dystrophy that has some kind of notoriety attached to it, but the agency allowed this product onto the market, the first treatment for a really fatal form of muscular dystrophy, because of the totality of evidence. Even though, again, the manufacturer didn't pick the right outcomes for their trial, there were some other signals that perhaps it would be instrumental in helping the boys to maintain upper body strength and some things that were important to them. So these are just some of the examples of how this idea of patient centricity and bringing patient perspectives to bear can help advance both the options that are available to patients and also the public health in terms of giving people better outcomes and more function and more enjoyment of life.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Appreciate it.